She sat through an entire dinner service alone at the most expensive table in the room, and by the time she finally accepted that he wasn't coming, the maitre d' had stopped pretending not to stare. But when the restaurant's front doors slammed shut and the locks turned from the outside, and the most feared crime lord in Toronto slid into the chair across from her, like he owned it, because he did, Nadia Kowalski realized that her date hadn't forgotten about her. He had sold her. The candle on the table had burned down nearly 2 inches. Nadia noticed this in the way she noticed everything. Quietly, precisely, with the kind of observational discipline that had made her exceptional at her job and invisible everywhere else. She was a forensic bookkeeper for a mid-sized corporate accounting firm on King Street West, the sort of woman who could find a $12 discrepancy in a 400-page ledger, but couldn't get a second date to save her life. She had thick thighs, a round face, and a laugh that her mother had once described as too much for a restaurant. She'd been working on making herself smaller ever since. Tonight, she had refused to be small. She had worn the burgundy dress, the one she'd ordered online in October and let hang in the back of her closet for 3 months because she couldn't decide if she deserved it. It was a deep wine red, fitted, with a neckline she'd almost covered with a scarf before talking herself out of it at the last second. Her best friend Priya had zipped her in and told her she looked like a woman men wrote novels about. Nadia had cried a little in the bathroom afterward, fixed her mascara, and gotten into a cab. The reservation had been for 7 o'clock at Vantage, one of those restaurants that didn't post its prices online because the clientele wasn't supposed to need to check. It sat on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, all dark wood paneling and low amber lighting and the kind of silence that cost money. Nadia had never been. She'd passed it 100 times on her walk to the subway and never once thought she'd sit at one of its tables. Ryan Ashford had insisted on it. They'd matched on an app 6 weeks ago. He was a financial consultant, or so his profile said. He had a jaw like a magazine ad and a way of texting that made her feel like she was the only person in whatever room he was imagining. He'd called her twice, actual phone calls, not voice notes, and listened while she talked about her work, her family, the neighborhood she'd grown up in out in Scarborough. He told her she was the most grounded woman he'd ever met. He said he was intimidated by women who actually understood numbers. He'd made the reservation himself, emailed her the confirmation, and told her to dress like she meant it. She had. And he hadn't come. By 8:30, she'd sent 3 texts. By 9, she'd stopped checking her phone. The waiter, a young man named Daniel, who had the particular misery of someone forced to witness other people's humiliation as a professional obligation, had refilled her water glass 5 times without being asked. She'd ordered a small plate of bread at 7:15 and hadn't touched the entree menu because ordering dinner alone felt like giving up. At 9:40, she finally accepted it. She wasn't stood up because something had come up. She wasn't stood up because he was in an accident or a work emergency or any of the other stories she'd been quietly constructing in his defense all evening. He had done this deliberately. She didn't know why yet, but she knew it in the way she knew numbers. Something didn't balance. And when something didn't balance, it meant someone had made a choice. Nadia reached into her clutch for her card. She would pay for the bread and the sparkling water and the 2 glasses of wine she'd consumed for courage, and she would go home, and she would not cry until she was in the elevator of her building where nobody could see her. She never got the chance to flag down Daniel. The change in the room happened the way a power outage does. Not with drama, but with sudden total absence. The piano that had been playing softly near the bar went silent mid-phrase. The low hum of 30 separate conversations dropped to nothing. The maitre d', a rigid man named Henri, who had looked at Nadia's solo arrival with barely concealed pity, had gone the color of old ash and taken 3 deliberate steps backward from the entrance. 4 men walked in. They were not dressed like diners. They were dressed like a warning. Dark suits, immaculate, the kind of tailoring that didn't come from anywhere with a storefront. They moved through the room in a formation that was almost geometric, and every person in the restaurant had the immediate animal instinct to stop moving. The man who followed them in was the reason why. Nadia had lived in Toronto her whole life. She read the news. She understood. The way most people in the city understood. Theoretically, distantly. The way you understand how a nuclear reactor works without ever expecting to stand next to one. That there were people who operated behind the city's surface. People who ran things that didn't appear in any budget or annual report. She had never expected to see one of them in person, but she recognized Dorian Voss the way you recognize a thunderstorm before it arrives. Not from a photograph, from the quality of the silence he produced. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had the kind of hard geometry that only comes from years of making decisions nobody else would. He was somewhere in his early 40s, and he moved like a man who had never once in his life needed to check if anyone was watching him. His eyes, dark grey, almost colorless in the amber light, swept the room once with the efficiency of a camera shutter. Taking inventory, one of his men stepped forward and addressed the room in a voice that didn't need to be raised to fill it. Vantage is closed for a private event. Please leave your tables and exit through the service corridor at the rear of the kitchen. Leave your belongings. You'll be contacted about arrangements. There was a 3-second pause, and then the room collapsed into itself. Chairs scraping, panic of people who understood that the correct response to this situation was to comply without complaint. A woman left a full glass of champagne. A man in a suit that probably cost more than Nadia's monthly rent abandoned his steak mid-cut. Within 19 seconds, the dining room was empty, except for Nadia. She hadn't moved. She'd wanted to. Her legs had simply declined the invitation, rooted to the floor by a terror, so clean and total it had bypassed panic entirely, and arrived at something closer to stillness. She sat in her burgundy dress at her corner table with her clutch in her lap, and her untouched entree menu, and the stub of a candle, and she could not make herself stand. Dorian Voss's gaze found her the way a compass finds north. Without searching, he walked through the empty restaurant, like the absence of other people, was simply the natural condition of any room he entered. And he stopped at her table. Up close, he was even more disquieting, not because he was loud or threatening in any performative way, but because he was completely, unnervingly still. He smelled of cedar and something cold, like winter air off Lake Ontario. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, without asking, he sat down across from her, in Ryan's chair. "You're the accountant," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the slight rounding of someone who'd grown up in the city's West End. Nadia's brain did something complicated. The terror was still there, but something had shorted out behind it. Some circuit of self-preservation that had apparently decided that if she was going to die tonight, she was at least going to be confused about it first. "I'm sorry?" "The accountant," Dorian repeated, leaning forward slightly, his large hands resting flat on the table. His eyes moved to the empty chair she'd been staring at for 2.5 hours. "You don't look like someone who launders money." The name arrived like a stone dropping into still water. "I'm not an accountant for..." Nadia stopped, started again. "What does Ryan have to do with any of this?" Something shifted in Dorian's expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like the particular attention a very intelligent person gives a very unexpected variable. "Ryan Ashford," he said, "has been managing a particular set of financial accounts for my organization for the past 4 years. 3 days ago, we discovered a gap, a significant one." He said this with the same effect someone might use to describe a misplaced parking ticket. $1.8 million moved through 12 shell accounts over the past 8 months. Rerouted to a private offshore structure, Mr. Ashford registered under a name that was not his own. Nadia stared at him. He told my associates he was meeting his partner here tonight. Dorian continued. The person who held the secondary authentication keys for the offshore account. He promised to hand them over in exchange for a conversation about the consequences he was facing. He looked at the empty chair again, then back at her. He is not here, you are. The pieces didn't slide into place so much as detonate. Ryan hadn't forgotten about her. He hadn't been busy. He had known, with complete certainty, that men like Dorian Voss would come to Vantage tonight looking for his contact. He had named a contact. He had given them a table number. He had given them a description of a woman in a burgundy dress. He had given them her. The terror didn't leave, but something white-hot moved in underneath it, and it burned considerably hotter. That absolute. Nadia stopped herself, pressing her lips together, because the word she wanted wasn't appropriate for a first meeting with a crime lord, and she was still, somehow, thinking about social appropriateness. He's been texting me for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of good morning messages. He remembered that I don't like cilantro. Dorian watched her with gauntlet, unreadable eyes. I wore this dress. She heard the break in her own voice and hated it. I took the afternoon off work. I told my colleagues I had a date, and they were happy for me because I don't do this. I don't put myself out there, I don't. She stopped again, her hands flat on the table, her jaw tight. I spent 45 minutes on my hair. She looked directly at Dorian Voss, which she suspected was not something most people did voluntarily. I don't have your money. I don't have any keys or accounts or anything to do with whatever he stole from you. I'm a bookkeeper for a dental supply company. I process invoices and quarterly remittances, and I have never in my entire life done anything even slightly illegal, and I would like to go home. Silence. One of the men behind Dorian, broad, scarred along the left cheek, with the patient expression of someone who'd been doing this a long time, stepped forward. She's not the contact, boss. Ashford played us. She's clean. Dorian didn't look at him. He hadn't stopped looking at Nadia. She's not going home, he said, and his voice was entirely, inexplicably calm. Nadia felt the blood leave her face. Mr. Voss, Ashford used you as a decoy, he said. My people were watching his movements. He knew that. He manufactured a blind date at a location he knew we'd converge on, put a woman at table 11 in a red dress, and slipped out of the country while we sat in surveillance vans on Adelaide Street. He paused. The people Ashford sold information to, and there are several of them, will assume, when they hear about tonight, that the woman at table 11 was his actual partner, that she knows where the accounts are, but I don't. They won't care. His voice wasn't unkind. It was simply factual, the way a weather forecast is factual. You go home tonight, you're a liability. Not mine. Theirs. He watched her process this. You have a choice. You leave alone, and by tomorrow morning, people who are considerably less patient than I am will be asking you questions about information you don't have. Or you come with me, and no one touches you while Ashford is being located. And after he's located, something moved across Dorian's face. Brief, final. Then the problem resolves. Nadia looked at the candle, looked at the untouched menu, looked at the chair where Ryan was supposed to have been sitting, in the restaurant he was supposed to have taken her to, on the date that was supposed to have been a fresh start. She picked up her clutch. If I find out you're lying to me, she said, I will take your finances apart from the inside and leave pieces of them all over the CRA's desk. I used to work for the Receiver General's office. I know what a forensic audit looks like from both sides. It was a bluff. She had done one contract for a federal department 8 years ago for 6 months, processing payroll adjustments. But she held eye contact when she said it, because she was very good at that. Dorian Voss looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent. "Come on," he said, and stood. The drive north was long and quiet. Toronto slid past the tinted windows, the financial district giving way to Yorkville, then the older money of Forest Hill, then darkness and tree lines, and the kind of property that doesn't appear on real estate listings. Nadia sat with her clutch in her lap and her spine straight, and her face arranged in an expression she hoped read as composed rather than terrified. Dorian sat beside her and said nothing. His presence was like a weather system. You couldn't ignore it. You could only sit inside it and wait for it to tell you what it was going to do. The compound, she didn't have another word for it, was a large stone house behind a gate that opened before the car reached it. Inside, high ceilings, wide hallways, the kind of quiet that comes from very good insulation and no children. It smelled of wood polish and coffee, and, faintly, something sharp she categorized as gunpowder, without letting herself think too hard about why she recognized it. Dorian led her to a sitting room with 2 dark green sofas and a fireplace that was already going. A woman in her 50s brought tea without being asked and disappeared without making eye contact. "You can sleep in the East Wing," Dorian said. "Victor will show you." "I'd rather know what happens next," Nadia said. He looked at her. "Tomorrow we'll know more about where Ashford went, and in the meantime, you want me to just sit here? Yes, in your house, in my house." Nadia set her clutch on the sofa cushion beside her. "Do you do this a lot? Bring strangers home?" Something in his expression shifted. It was the second time she'd managed to surprise him, and she was keeping count. "No," he said. "Why me, then?" He looked at her for long enough that it stopped being a pause and started being a decision. "Because Ashford looked at you and saw a prop," Dorian said quietly, "and he was wrong about you in ways that are going to cost him significantly." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Get some sleep, Miss Kowalski. Tomorrow will be long." He left. The fire crackled. Nadia sat in the green sofa in her burgundy dress in a crime lord's house somewhere north of the city and drank her tea, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that some part of her, some quiet, treacherous part, had felt, for the first time all evening, like someone had actually seen her. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. In the morning, it was the sound of raised voices that woke her. Not shouting, exactly, but the kind of controlled urgency that carries through walls when the walls are worried. She found her way to the main room in the clothes she'd slept in, clutch still in hand out of some reflex she couldn't explain, and found Dorian standing over a large table covered in screens and printed documents, speaking in low, rapid French to the scarred man she now knew was called Renaud. They both looked up when she entered. Ashford used a secondary device, Dorian. The account keys aren't on his primary phone bill. The account keys aren't on his primary phone. We pulled his cloud backup. It's clean. He either transferred the data before he ran, or he stored it somewhere external. Nadia moved closer to the table. The documents were a mix of financial records and what looked like surveillance logs. She looked at the account structure displayed on the nearest screen. A web of numbered routing codes, offshore, nodes, and felt the particular calm that came over her whenever she was looking at numbers that were lying. "He would have encrypted it," she said, more to herself than to them. Renaud looked at her sideways. Dorian did not. "Go on," he said. "Ryan is not a sophisticated man. He's charming, but he's not sophisticated. He wouldn't have built this layering himself. Someone structured this for him, and he would have wanted the authentication in something he already trusted, something he used every day without thinking." She looked up. Did he use any shared platforms? Project management tools, cloud accounting software? "We can pull his work accounts," Renaud said slowly. "Don't bother with the accounts he opened." "The accounts he could." Nadia shook her head. "Look for ones he was invited to. Secondary users. Places where he was added to someone else's workspace and forgot he was still logged in." There was a silence. "I'll get the tech team," Renaud said and moved. Dorian was watching her with an expression she still didn't have a word for. "You do this for dental supplies," he said. "I do this for anyone who needs it." She met his gaze evenly. Numbers don't actually care who owns them. It took the tech team 4 hours. In that time, Nadia sat at the table and worked through every account pathway visible on the screens, marking discrepancy on a yellow legal pad someone had found for her. Dorian came and went. He brought her a coffee without asking how she took it, and it was exactly right, which bothered her more than she expected. At 2 in the afternoon, Renault returned. "We found it," he said. A legacy collaboration workspace, 3 years old. Ashford was added by a former associate and never removed his login. He uploaded a single encrypted file 4 days ago, right before he ran. File name is a string of numbers. He paused. He sent the decryption key to someone external. Our intercept shows it went to a Toronto area device. Nadia's phone buzzed on the table. Everyone in the room looked at it. It was a text from Ryan, a link to what appeared to be a document, with a message. "Nadia, important. Open this and screenshot everything inside before 4 p.m. today or the access expires. It's about the date. I can explain everything. Please just do this first." The room was very quiet. Nadia looked at Dorian. He looked at her. "He sent it to you," Dorian said. His voice was low and completely without inflection. "He sent the decryption key to your phone." "Because I'm nobody," Nadia said. The bitterness in her own voice was clean and total. "Because no one would think to check. Because he needed a carrier who wouldn't know what she was carrying and wouldn't throw it away." She set the phone down carefully on the table. "He's been 1 step ahead of you this whole time by being 2 steps behind me." She pushed the phone toward Dorian. "Do what you need to do with it!" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and Renault picked up the phone and left the room at something approaching a jog. Nadia stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the property stretched back into bare November trees, grey sky, the beginning of a light snow that hadn't decided to commit yet. She was aware of Dorian coming to stand beside her, not close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "He called you nobody," Dorian said. "He hasn't called me anything yet. You haven't found him, we will." "I know." She watched the snow. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" She turned to look at him, up close, in daylight, without the dim amber drama of a restaurant. He looked less like an icon of something and more like a person. Tired around the eyes, careful in a way that wasn't about threat so much as habit. A man who had been vigilant for so long that vigilance had become the shape of his face. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I've spent 10 years making myself easy to overlook. Good at my job, quiet, don't take up too much space, don't have opinions that inconvenience anyone. And the one time I let my guard down, the one time I wore the dress and showed up and decided I was allowed to want something, someone looked at me and thought, perfect. Nobody will check her." She didn't expect him to say anything useful. People never did with this kind of thing. They said, "You're not nobody," or "Don't let one person define you," or "Some version of you deserve better." All of which was true and none of which helped. Dorian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You found the account pathway in 4 hours that my financial team missed for 3 days." She blinked. "You walked into a room with 4 armed men and didn't scream," he continued, his voice even. "You negotiated your own exit terms with the head of a criminal organization, while still angry about a date. You identified the transmission vector for a stolen financial key because you understand how people think when they believe no one is watching them." He looked at her steadily. "Ashford didn't use you because you were easy to overlook. He used you because you were the most capable person in his periphery, and he was afraid of what you'd do if you were ever actually paying attention." Nadia looked at him for a long time. "That's a very generous reading," she said finally. "I don't do generous readings," Dorian said. "I do accurate ones." At 11 that night, Renault came back. Ryan Ashford, had been located at a rental property in Wasaga Beach, registered under a name that had cleared a background check, because the background check had been filed by someone who no longer worked for the relevant federal office. He was alone. He had a duffel bag, and the particular desperation of a man who had believed, right up until the headlights appeared in the window, that he'd been smarter than everyone. Dorian's men brought him to a warehouse on the eastern edge of the city. Nadia didn't go. She sat in the green sofa room and listened to the fire, and didn't ask what was happening, because she didn't need to. Numbers resolved to 0. Problems were balanced. This was how it worked. In the world she'd stepped into for one evening in a burgundy dress. At midnight, her phone rang. It was Ryan. She knew, from the quality of the sound on his end, the echo of a large space, the background presence of other people, that he hadn't called voluntarily. Nadia. His voice was wrecked. Nadia, listen, I know you're there with him. I know how this looks. It looks like what it is, she said. I didn't want to involve you. I had no choice. If I hadn't done it, they were going to. You remembered I don't like cilantro, Nadia said. You asked about my mother's knee surgery. You spent 6 weeks making me feel like someone was finally paying attention, and you did all of that because you needed a woman who would show up to a restaurant alone and wait long enough that your exit window stayed open. She paused. How long was I supposed to wait before you were clear of the country? Silence on the line. That's what I thought, she said. She heard Dorian's voice in the background, one word, low, and then Ryan's voice disappeared mid-breath and the line went dead. She set the phone down. She didn't cry. There wasn't anything left to cry about. The grief she'd carried all evening, the grief of being chosen and then discarded, of being used as a placeholder for something she'd actually wanted, had burned somewhere between the account pathways and the yellow legal pad, and a crime lord handing her a coffee that was exactly right. Dorian came back at 1 a.m. He looked like a man who had done something necessary and wasn't going to discuss it. It's over, he said. I know. He came and sat in the armchair across from her. The fire had burned low. Outside, the snow had committed. I can have a car take you home in the morning, he said. Nadia looked at him. Is it safe? Yes, the people Ashford was dealing with have their own problems now. He held her gaze. You're not a liability anymore. Good. She folded her hands in her lap. Then I have a proposal. He waited. Your financial infrastructure has at least 3 visible vulnerabilities that your current team hasn't caught. I saw them this morning in about 90 minutes. I'm not going to explain how I know what I know about offshore account structuring, and you're not going to ask. But I will tell you that whatever you're paying, whoever is currently managing your books, they're not earning it. Dorian looked at her for a long, measuring moment. You're proposing to work for me. I'm proposing to work for myself, on a consulting basis, at a rate that will reflect the fact that I found your money in a morning, and I'll want to be home by 6 every Thursday because I have pottery class. She kept her voice even. And if at any point I'm uncomfortable with what I'm asked to do, I walk. No conversations about it. The fire cracked quietly. Snow tapped the window. You're not afraid of me, Dorian said slowly. Not quite an accusation, something closer to wonder. I was terrified of you at the restaurant, Nadia said. I'm less terrified of you now. You're a dangerous man, with a considerable amount of institutional violence at your disposal, and I'm a woman who found your missing money in her pajamas this morning. I think we can come to an arrangement. Something moved through his expression, something she was beginning to recognize, not because it happened often, but because she was the one causing it, that particular quality of attention. The adjustment of a man recalibrating. Thursday evenings, he said, every week. And if I ask you to do something you're not comfortable with, then I'll tell you clearly and specifically what I'm not comfortable with, and you'll have to decide what to do with that information. She tilted her head slightly. I'd suggest listening. The corner of Dorian Voss's mouth moved in a way she was starting to think of as his version of a smile. "I'll have a contract drafted. I'll have my own lawyer review it." She paused. "I assume you know a lawyer who won't ask too many questions." "Several. Good." Outside, Toronto slept under its first proper snow. Somewhere on the other side of the city, Nadia's burgundy dress was hanging over the back of a chair in a guest room she hadn't expected to sleep in. Her hair was a disaster. Her mascara had migrated somewhere south of where it started. She had not eaten a real meal since breakfast of the previous day. She sat in a crime lord's living room at 1 in the morning and felt for the first time in longer than she could properly account for, entirely and precisely like herself. "One more thing," she said. Dorian raised an eyebrow. "The coffee this morning. You made it right without asking." "I notice things," he said. "So do I," she said. "That's why we're going to be very effective together." She picked up her tea, cold now, hours old, and drank it anyway, because she'd earned it. Dorian Voss, for the first time in longer than anyone who knew him could have remembered, did not have a response. He didn't need one. She was already looking out the window, watching the snow come down over a city that had underestimated her for the last time.